Let me just adjust this. Hello, welcome. Let's see how many friends we have. Just me. Okay. So, we are reading the Condensed for Home Appreciation, Home Course Appreciation, and it does come with a foreword. It looks like it's about the beginning of John Stuart Mill, where he comes from and why he wrote where he was. So, let us begin. William James dedicated his book Pragmatism to the memory of John Stuart Mill, who, he said, would be our leader if he were alive. James, up until the time of his own death in 1910, was the best-known philosopher America had produced. It is revealing that he felt such close kinship with the famous Englishman who preceded him by a generation. The basis of this kinship, and indeed the key to all that Mill did, can be seen in the two words that will always be associated with these two thinkers: utilitarianism and pragmatism. As philosophic terms, the first was given currency by Mill and the second by James. In each case, the use of the term evidenced a desire to emphasize observation as the only genuine basis of any knowledge and human experience as the final test of any idea. This emphasis implied a consistent effort to deal with all problems in the spirit and with the methods of science. Mill's goals and plans. In the fullest sense of the term, John Stuart Mill was a scientific philosopher, eminent as few modern thinkers have been. But more than that, he was a social philosopher who kept before himself the objective of improving the political and economic systems, the educational system, the legal and moral codes by which civilized men live. This is a reminder, this was written in 1956. Mill's awareness of social problems dates from his early childhood and reflected the enormous influence on him of his strong-minded father. James Mill, the author of A History of India, an analysis of the mind and works on a political economy, had, in a treatise on government, given great stimulus to the cause of reform. He was the earliest and one of the most principal proponents of the great happiness principle set down by Jeremy Bentham. The education that John Stuart Mill received from his father began with Greek when the boy was a 3-year-old and went on to include a thorough study of Bentham's system of philosophic radicalism. From the period of his early manhood, John Stuart Mill was identified with the radicals whose ideas found an outlet in the Westminster Review that Bentham had established in 1824. What did the Benthamite radicals hope to accomplish? Mill conceived of their objective as having two aspects, one intellectual, the other practical, and neither to be achieved independently of the other. Presently, the radical effort sought to educate the people to the point where everyone could at least read and write, to make government more representative of the will of all by extending suffrage and reforming the electoral system, to decrease and ultimately abolish the inequalities of professional opportunity between the few rich and the many poor, to shorten the working hours of the laboring class and raise their standing of living, to make the laws as binding on the powerful as they are on the weak. But Mill felt deeply that these practical objectives could never be gained unless a scientifically grounded body of theory was perfected to prove that basic and widespread improvements could be brought about, and to show what methods could be used. Such an objective involved not so much the working out of new doctrines in a half-dozen established fields, what amounted to the creation of a whole field of science. What we call social science today probably owes as much to Mill as to any other Englishman of the 19th century. Mill's objections to traditional morality. One of the most basic questions discussed by philosophers is, what is the nature of good and evil? What is the ultimate standard of ethics? That is the question Mill tries to answer in his brief but penetrating work, Utilitarianism. The traditional answers to this question did not satisfy him. For example, there was a theological answer, which said that moral commands were given to man by a superhuman being. Mill found a number of difficulties with accepting such an answer. One was that such an assumption renders the rules static. As the will of God, these rules could scarcely be the subjects, as other rules were, of the thought and debate of right-reasoning men. Rather, they would be alleged the subjects of interpretation by an ordained class which would not feel bound by the rules of reason and scientific logic based on observation and tested against objective fact. A mysteriously revealed dogma not produced by the mind of man and not to be judged by the mind of man, but still to be obeyed by him on the pain of eternal punishment, puts superstition and bigotry in the place of logic. Only too often, as Mill saw it, the clerical interpretations of the rules of morality resulted in keeping the rich powerful and the poor oppressed. As a result, the prevailing system served the ideals of brotherly love, altruism, and universal charity poorly, however worthy its intention. Mill further rejected the philosophical premise that questions of right and wrong conduct should be settled by reference to intuition, to the inner feelings, to some kind of more or less mysterious inner voice. In practice, as he saw it, such ideas usually led either to mere wishful thinking or to a hypocritical rationalizing of self-action. They lacked, as the theological notions did, a logical proof of their nature and an objective test of their worth. Water. The ethics of utilitarianism. What standard of morals would Mill himself set up? What was his own explanation of the way in which moral codes come into being? Moral codes are produced by the human mind. They represent an effort to prescribe those forms of behavior, those individual and group practices which will be of maximum utility to the people setting up the codes. This answer, Mill felt, placed the whole matter on a proper footing and had the effect of putting common sense and reason in the center of the action. What makes a given rule of conduct right or good is that following the rule results in more social utility than not following it. Contrariwise, if not following a certain rule of conduct results in more societal utility than following it, that means the rule in question is wrong and evil. The terms utility and happiness, as Mill used them, meant the same thing. Therefore, these rules of conduct are right which result in the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Thus, in judging the moral right or wrong of a given action or rule of action, Mill's emphasis was not on the intentions of the doer, but on the consequences of the action. And in evaluating these consequences, Mill was careful to stress that it was not simply the utility or happiness of the individual doer that was to be taken into account. It was the measure of utility for everyone which determined the judgment. He wrote, I must again repeat what the assailants of utilitarianism seldom have the justice to acknowledge, that the happiness which forms the utilitarian standard of what is right in conduct is not the agent's own happiness, but that of all concerned. As between his own happiness and that of others, utilitarianism requires him to be as strictly impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectator. It is characteristic of Mill that he should say, immediately following the words just quoted, in the golden rule of Jesus of Nazareth, we have the complete spirit of the ethics of utility. To do as you would be done by, and to love your neighbor as yourself constitute the ideal perfection of utilitarian morality. Mill did not consider the rule of conduct which Jesus expressed a good rule simply because Jesus had expressed it, nor because it was the will and command of God, but because it would logically lead to the maximum human utility to the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Moreover, to carry out the implications of the Golden Rule, as Mill construed it, to apply it in the actual life of a people would mean to do far more than orthodox thinkers seemed willing to do. It would mean changing and improving not only personal attitudes, manners, feelings. It would mean changing and improving the political and economic institution, changing laws of property, abolishing privileges, equalizing opportunities, adjusting taxation, and other such matters. Scientific method, utilitarian morality, and democracy went hand in hand. Liberty, the individual, and society. Referring to his great essay on liberty, Mill declares in his autobiography, none of my writings have either been so carefully composed or so sedulously corrected as this. I am not sure I pronounced that correctly. Sedulously. Sedulosly. Corrected as this. Though by no means a lengthy volume, it had, he felt, a central place in his philosophy. Describing its birth and growth, he adds, I had at first planned and written it as a short essay in 1854. It was in mounting the steps of the Capitol in January 1855 that the thought first arose of converting it into a volume. After it had been written as usual twice over, we, meaning he and his wife, kept it by us, bringing it out from time to time and going through it de novo, reading, weighing, and criticizing every sentence. In writing this book, Mill evidently had a number of purposes in mind. For one thing, he wanted to deliver a blow against conformity, a creeping blight which Mill considered one of the deadliest of social maladies. He also wanted to do that which had never yet been done in any clear and effective way, to define the limits beyond which society should not interfere with the individual, to define and justify the area within which the individual should be allowed to go his own way. More water. The problem of conformity. In our times, says Mill, from the highest class of society down to the lowest, everyone lives under the eye of a hostile and dreaded censorship. The individual or the family do not ask themselves, what do I prefer, or what would suit my character and disposition, or what would allow the best and brightest in me to have fair play and enable it to grow and thrive. Grow and thrive. They ask themselves, what is suitable to my position? What is usually done by persons of my station? I do not mean that they choose what is customary in preference to what suits their own inclination. It does not occur to them to have any inclination except for what is customary. Thus the mind itself is bowed to the yoke. Even in what do people do for pleasure, conformity is the first thing thought of. The intellectual and moral price paid for this conformity, Mill points out, is appalling. People are afraid of being thought radical or even liberal. They are afraid of arguing or debating public issues except within officially approved limits. They are afraid of ideas in general, so anxious are they to avoid the suspicion of having dangerous ones. In the end, they are afraid to think. Mind and character alike are stultified. Where, then, should the line be drawn between the area within which the individual should have complete freedom and the area within which society should have the legitimate power to apply penalties, either legal or non-legal, to control him and ensure his conformity? Mill answers this question in a famous passage, one of the most frequently quoted from On Liberty. The object of this essay is to assert one very simple principle, as entitled to govern absolutely the dealings of society with the individual is the way of compulsion and control, whether the means used be physical force in the form of legal penalties or the moral coercion of public opinion. That principle is that the sole end for which these men are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. That is the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised for any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. The harm which Mill had in mind was, of course, objective and tangible harm. This was on no account to be confused with harm that might be imagined to result from ideas, whether considered by the government or by the majority of the people to be erroneous or dangerous. Any pressure or penalty exerted by government to discourage or suppress ideas or doctrines is, in its net effects, socially detrimental, Mill held, whether the ideas are right or wrong, and whether the suppressing is done in accordance with the majority will or not. If all mankind minus one were of one opinion, Mill says, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. tyranny of the majority. Mill sensed that the growth of economic productivity and the pressures of democratic politics, in the narrower sense of the term, created dangers by placing the individual at the mercy of social forces that would be increasingly difficult to resist. Some of the most challenging parts of Mill's exposition of liberty are concerned with the tyranny of the majority, which, he maintains, even though it may evoke no legal penalty, can be as vicious as any other kind of tyranny. Protection, he says, against the tyranny of the magistrate is not enough. There must be protection also against the tyranny of the prevailing opinion, against the tendency of society to impose, by other means than civil penalties, its own ideas and practices as rules of conduct on those who dissent from them, to fetter the development and, if possible, prevent the formation of any individuality not in harmony with its ways. The strange education of John Stuart Mill. Partly because he lacked the means to hire tutors of his choosing, and partly because he possessed the intense convictions on the subject of education, James Mill himself undertook the instruction of his son. The boy was started on the Greek vocabulary at the age of 3. Before he was 8, he had read in the original Aesop's Fables, Herodotus, Xenophon, Diogenes Laertius, 6 dialogues of Plato, and other Greek works. Along the way he went through arithmetic, and I well remember its disagreeableness, and, with great delight, began the study of history with no less formidable volumes than those of Hume, Gibbon, and Plutarch. In my 8th year, says Mill in his autobiography, I commenced learning Latin in conjunction with a younger sister, to whom I taught it as I went on, and who afterwards repeated the lessons to my father, and from this time other sisters and brothers being successively added as pupils, a considerable part of my day's work consisted of this preparatory teaching. Mill stated his dislike of the task, but added an acute comment that shows that even an 8-year-old teacher absorbs one of the greatest values of giving instruction. I, however, derived from this discipline the great advantage of learning more thoroughly and retaining more lastingly the things which I was set to teach. Perhaps, too, the practice it afforded in explaining difficulties to others may even at that age have been useful. When literature, logic, political economy, and physical science had been added to his subjects, Mill could truly say he was given, during the years of childhood, an amount of knowledge in what are considered the higher branches of education which is seldom acquired, if acquired at all, until the age of manhood. I started, I may fairly say, with an advantage of a quarter of a century over my contemporaries. Society and family life. Under these circumstances, it is hardly surprising that while Mill was still in his teens, he was discussing advanced intellectual questions with some of the leading figures of the day, Bentham, Ricardo, and Grote, among others. In 1822, when he was 16, he formed a small club of like-minded young men and called it the Utilitarian Society, whose name represented the first use of the term utilitarian to designate a philosophical attitude. The society had a life of about 3.5 years. A few years later, Mill was one of the leading spirits in founding a debating society in London, at whose meetings a select group of able minds contended with one another. Like his father, he was one of the principal contributors to the Westminster Review over many years. His associates in these undertakings were often called utilitarian radicals or philosophic radicals. They considered both traditional parties, Tory and Whig, too conservative and aristocratic to serve the cause of the people and of progress. Like his father, Mill occupied an important post in the East India Company and exercised, as much as he could, a liberalizing influence on British policy in India. In 1851, when he was 45, he married a widow, Miss Taylor, whom he had known and admired for 20 years. His praises of her character and mind are high, and she greatly aided him in some of his most important writings. Mill was elected a member of Parliament, serving from 1865 to 68, in spite of his refusal to spend any money for a campaign. He died in 1873 at the age of 67. Mill's influence. The philosophy of John Stuart Mill was a natural outgrowth of the great empirical tradition, which stresses observation, experience, and practical application, as embodied in the works of Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and David Hume. Mill not only reflected the spirit of that tradition, but carried it further, especially into social fields and into the theory of logic and scientific method. His influence was particularly notable on philosophers like Huxley, William James, and John Dewey. It was felt in Eastern Europe among the classical Russian social thinkers of the 19th century, and to a certain extent in Far Eastern countries. Contemporary movements such as pragmatism, instrumentalism, positivism, positivism, and humanism owe much directly or indirectly to John Stuart Mill. His work is read and studied wherever philosophy is taught. That concludes the foreword, and we are about to jump right into utilitarianism. There is a note. Mill's first chapter, entitled General Remarks, notes that from the dawn of philosophy, the question concerning the foundation of morality has been the main problem in speculative thought. Since men's sentiments are greatly influenced by what they suppose to be the effect of things upon their happiness, the principle of utility, which Jeremy Bentham called the greatest happiness principle, has had a large share in forming moral doctrines. This essay will be an attempt to elucidate the utilitarian or happiness theory, and then an examination of the rational grounds that can be given for accepting or rejecting the utilitarian formula. That is all that is mentioned for Chapter 1. We are heading right into Chapter 2. Chapter 2. What Utilitarianism is. A passing remark is all that needs to be given to the ignorant blunder of supposing that those who stand up for utility as the test of right and wrong use the term in that restricted and merely colloquial sense in which utility is opposed to pleasure. An apology is due to the philosophical opponents of utilitarianism for even the momentary appearance of confounding them with anyone capable of so absurd a misconception, which is the more extraordinary, inasmuch as the contrary accusation of referring everything to pleasure, and that too in its grossest form, is another of the common charges against utilitarianism, and, as has been pointedly remarked by an able writer, the same sort of persons, and very often the same persons, denounce the theory as impracticably dry when the word utility precedes the word pleasure, and as too practicably voluptuous when the word pleasure precedes the word utility. Those who know anything about the matter are aware that every writer, from Epicurus to Bentham, who maintained the theory of utility, meant by it not something to be contradistinguished from pleasure, but pleasure itself, together with exemption from pain, and instead of opposing the useful to the agreeable or the ornamental, have always declared that the useful means these, among other things. Yet the common herd, including the herd of writers, not only in newspapers and periodicals, but in books of weight and pretension, are perpetually falling into this shallow mistake. Having caught up the word utilitarian, while knowing nothing whatsoever about it but its sound, they habitually express it by the rejection or the neglect or of pleasure in some of its forms, of beauty, of ornament, or of amusement. Nor is the term thus ignorantly misapplied solely in disparagement, but occasionally in compliment, as though it implied superiority to frivolity and the mere pleasures of the moment. And this perverted use is the only one in which the word is popularly known, and the one from which the new generation are acquiring their sole notion of its meaning. Those who introduced the word, but who had for many years discontinued it as a distinctive appellation, may well feel themselves called upon to resume it, if by doing so they hope they can contribute anything towards rescuing it from this utter degradation. There's a footnote. I will drink my water and then I will read the footnote. The author of this essay has reason for believing himself the first person who brought the word utilitarian into use. He did not invent it, but adopted it from a passing expression in Mr. Galt's Annals of the Parish. After using it as a designation for several years, he and others abandoned it from a growing dislike of anything resembling a badge or watchword of sectarian distinction. but as a name for one single opinion, not a set of opinions, to denote the recognition of utility as a standard, not any particular way of applying it. The term supplies a want in the language and offers, in many cases, a convenient mode of avoiding tiresome circumlocution. The footnote is noted as having been made by Mill. Back into the main text. The creed which adopts the formation of as the foundation of morals, utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. To give a clear view of the moral standards set up by the theory, much more requires to be said, in particular what things it includes in the ideas of pain and pleasure, and to what extent this is left an open question. But those supplementary explanations do not affect the theory on life of which this theory of morality is grounded, namely that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends, and that all desirable things, which are as numerous in the utilitarian as in any other scheme, are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or as means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. Now, such a theory of life excites many minds, and among them is some of the most estimable in feeling and purpose, inverterate dislike. To suppose that life has, as they express it, no higher end than pleasure, no better and nobler object of desire and pursuit, they designate as utterly mean and groveling, as a doctrine worthy only of swine, to whom the followers of Epicurus were, at a very early period, contemptuously likened, and modern holders of the doctrine are occasionally made the subject of equally polite comparisons by its German, French, and English assailants. When thus attacked, the Epicureans have always answered that it is not they, but their accusers who represent human nature in a degrading light, since the accusation supposes humans to be capable of no pleasures except those of which swine are capable. If this supposition were true, the charge could not be gainsaid, but would then be no longer an imputation. For if the sources of pleasure were precisely the same to human beings and to swine, the rule of life which is good enough for the one would be good enough for the other. The comparison of the Epicurean life to that of beasts is felt as degrading, precisely because a beast's pleasures do not satisfy a human being's conceptions of happiness. Human beings have faculties more elevated than the animal appetites, and when once made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness which does not include their gratification. I do not, indeed, consider the Epicureans to have been by any means faultless in drawing out their scheme of consequences from the utilitarian principle. To do this in any sufficient manner, many Stoic as well as Christian elements require to be included. But there is no known Epicurean theory of life which does not assign to the pleasures of the intellect, of the feelings and imagination, and of the moral sentiments a much higher value as pleasures than to those of mere sensation. It must be admitted, however, that utilitarian writers in general have placed a superiority of mental over bodily pleasures chiefly in the greater permanency, safety, uncostliness, etc. of the former, that is, in their circumstantial advantages rather than in their intrinsic nature. And on all these points utilitarians have fully proved their case, but they might have taken the other, and as it might be called higher ground, with entire consistency. It is quite compatible with the principle of utility to recognize this fact, that some kinds of pleasure are more desirable and more valuable than others. It would be absurd that while, in estimating all other things, quality is considered as well as quantity, the estimation of pleasures should be supposed to depend on quality alone. If I am asked, what I mean by difference of quality in pleasures, or what makes one pleasure more valuable than another, merely as a pleasure, except its being greater in amount, there is but one possible answer. Of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experience of both give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that is the more desirable pleasure. If one of the two is, by those who are competently acquainted with both, placed so far above the other that they prefer it, even though knowing it to be attended with a greater amount of discontent, and would not resign it for any quantity of the other pleasure which their nature is capable of, we are justified in ascribing to the preferred enjoyment a superiority in quality, so far outweighing quantity as to render it in comparison of small amount. Now, it is an unquestionable fact that those who are equally acquainted with and equally capable of appreciating and enjoying both do give a marked preference to the manner of existence which employs their higher faculties. Few human creatures would consent to be changed into any of the lower animals for a promise of the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures. No intelligent human being would consent to be a fool, no instructed person would be an ignoramus, no person of feeling and conscience would be selfish and base, even though they should be persuaded that the fool, the dunce, or the rascal is better satisfied with his lot than they are with theirs. They would not resign what they possess more than he for the most complete satisfaction of all the desires which they have in common with him. If they ever fancy they would, it is only in cases of unhappiness so extreme that to escape from it they would exchange their lot for almost any other, however undesirable in their own eyes. That. A being of higher faculties requires more to make him happy, is capable probably of more acute suffering, and certainly accessible to it at more points than one of an inferior type. But in spite of these liabilities, he can never really wish to sink into what he feels to be a lower grade of existence. We may give what explanation we please of this unwillingness. We may attribute it to pride, a name which is given indiscriminately to some of the most and to some of the least estimable feelings of which mankind are capable. We may refer to it the love of liberty and personal independence, an appeal to which was with the Stoics one of the most effective means for the inoculation of it, to the love of power or to the love of excitement, both of which really do enter into and contribute to it. But its most appropriate appellation is a sense of dignity, which all human beings possess in one form or another, and in some, though by no means in an exact proportion to their higher faculties, and which is so essential a part of the happiness of those in whom it is strong, that nothing which conflicts with it could be, otherwise than momentarily, an object of desire to them. Whoever supposes that this preference takes place at a sacrifice of happiness, that the superior being in anything like equal circumstances is not happier than the inferior, confounds the two very different ideas of happiness and content. It is indisputable that the being whose faculties of enjoyment are low has the greatest chance of having them fully satisfied, and a highly endowed being will always feel that any happiness which he can look for, as the world is constituted, is imperfect. But he can learn to bear its imperfections if they are at all bearable, and they will not make him envy the being who is indeed unconscious of the imperfections, but only because he feels not at all the good which those imperfections qualify. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, that is because they only know their side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. I don't know. I've never been a pig. It may be objected that many who are capable of the higher pleasures occasionally, under the influence of temptation, postpone them to the lower. But it is quite comparable with a full appreciation of the intrinsic superiority of the higher. Men often, from infirmity of character, make their election for the nearer good, though they know it to be the less valuable, and this no less when the choice is between two bodily pleasures than when it is between bodily and mental. They pursue sensual indulgences to the injury of health, though perfectly aware that health is the greater good. It may be further objected that many who begin with youthful enthusiasm for everything noble, as they advance in years sink into indolence and selfishness. But I do not believe that those who undergo this very common change voluntarily choose the lesser description of pleasures in preference to the higher. I believe that before they devote themselves exclusively to the one, they have already become incapable of the other. Capacity for the noble feelings is in most natures a very tender plant, easily killed, not only by hostile influences, but by mere want of sustenance. And the majority of young persons it speedily dies away if the occupations to which their position in life has devoted them, and the society into which it has thrown them, are not favorable to keeping that higher capacity in exercise. Men lose their high aspirations as they lose their intellectual tastes, because they have not time or opportunity for indulging them. And they addict themselves to inferior pleasures, not because they deliberately prefer them, but because they are the only ones to which they have access, or the only ones which they are any longer capable of enjoying. It may be questioned whether anyone who has remained equally susceptible to both classes of pleasure ever knowingly and calmly preferred the lower, though many in all ages have broken down in an ineffectual attempt to combine both. From this verdict of the only competent judges, I append there can be no appeal. On a question which is the best worth having of two pleasures, or which of two modes of existence is the most grateful to the feelings, apart from its moral attributes and its consequences, the judgment of those who are qualified by knowledge of both, or if they differ, that of the majority among them, must be admitted as final. And there needs to be the less hesitation to accept this judgment respecting the quality of pleasure, since there is no other tribunal to be referred to even on the question of quantity. Which means there are of determining which is the What means there are of determining which is the acutest of two pains, or the intensest of two pleasurable sensations, except the general suffrage of those who are familiar with both. Neither pains nor pleasures are homogeneous, and pain is always heterogeneous with pleasure. What is there to decide whether a particular pleasure is worth purchasing at the cost of a particular pain, except the feelings and judgments of the experienced? When, therefore, those feelings and judgment declare the pleasures derived from the higher faculties to be preferable in a kind, apart from the question of intensity, to those of which the animal nature, disjointed from the higher faculties, is susceptible, they are entitled on this subject to the same regard. I have dwelt on this point as being a necessary part of a perfectly just conception of utility or happiness, considered as the directive rule of human conduct, but it is by no means an indispensable condition to the acceptance of the utilitarian standard, for that standard is not the agent's own happiness, but the greater amount of happiness altogether. And if it may possibly be doubted whether a noble character is always the happier for its nobleness, there can be no doubt that it makes other people happier, and that the world in general is immensely a gainer by it. Utilitarianism, therefore, could only attain its end by the general cultivation of nobleness of character, even if each individual were only benefited by the nobleness of others, and his own, so far as happiness is concerned, were a sheer deduction from the benefit. But the bare enunciation of such an absurdity as this last renders refutation superfluous. According to the greatest happiness principle, as above explained, the ultimate end, with reference to and for the sake of which all other things are desirable, whether we are considering our own good or that of other people, is an existence exempt as far as possible from pain, and as rich as possible in enjoyments, both in the point of quantity and quality. The test of quality and the rule for measuring it against quantity, the preference being felt by those who in their opportunities of experience, to which must be added their habits of self-consciousness and self-observation, are best furnished with the means of comparison. This being, according to the utilitarian opinion, the end of human action, is necessarily defined also the standard of morality, which may accordingly be defined the rules and precepts for human conduct, by the observation of which an existence such as has been described to be, to the greatest extent possible, secure to all mankind, and not to them only, but so far as the nature of things admits to the whole sentient creation. Against this doctrine, however, rises another class of objectors, who say that happiness, in any form, cannot be the rational purpose of human life and action, because, in the first place, it is unattainable, and they contemptuously ask, "What right hast thou to be happy?" A question which Mr. Carlyle clenches by the addition, "What right, a short time ago, hadst thou even to be?" Needless, they say, that men can do without happiness, that all noble human beings have felt this, and could not have become noble by learning the lesson of Entsagen, or renunciation, which lesson, thoroughly learned and submitted to, they affirm to be the beginning and necessary condition of all virtue. The first of these objections would go to the root of the matter where it well founded. For if no happiness is to be had at all by human beings, the attainment of it cannot be the end of morality, or of any rational conduct. Though, even in that case, something might still be said for utilitarian theory, since utility includes not solely the pursuit of happiness, but the prevention or mitigation of unhappiness. And if the former aim be chimeral, there will be all the greater scope and a more imperative need for the latter, as long at least as mankind think fit to live, and do not take refuge in the simultaneous act of suicide recommended under certain conditions by Novalis. I have no idea who that is. When, however, it is positively asserted that to be impossible that human life should be happy, the assertion, if not something like a verbal quibble, is at least an exaggeration. If happiness be meant a continuity of highly pleasurable excitement, it is evident enough that this is impossible. A state of exalted pleasure lasts only moments, or in some cases, and with some intermissions, hours or days, and is the occasional bright flash of enjoyment, not its permanent and steady flame. Of this the philosophers who have taught that happiness is the end of life were as fully aware as those who taunt them. The happiness which they meant was not a life of rapture, but moments of such, and an existence made up of few and transitory pains, many and various pleasures, with a decided predominance of the active over the passive, and having as the foundation of the whole not to expect more from life than it is capable of bestowing. A life thus composed, to those who have been fortunate enough to obtain it, has always appeared worthy of the name of happiness, and such an existence is even now the lot of many, during some considerable portion of their lives. The present wretched education and wretched social arrangements are the only real hindrance to its being attainable by almost all. Had to adjust. The objectors may doubt whether human beings, if taught to consider happiness as the end of life, would be satisfied with such a moderate share of it. But great numbers of mankind have been satisfied with much less. The main constituents of a satisfied life appear to be two, either of which by itself is often found sufficient for the purpose: tranquillity and excitement. With much tranquillity, many find that they can be content with very little pleasure. With much excitement, many can reconcile themselves to a considerable quantity of pain. There is assuredly no inherent impossibility from enabling even the mass of mankind to unite both, since two are so far from being incompatible that they are a natural alliance, the prolongation of either being a preparation for and exciting a wish for the other. It is only those in whom indolence amounts to a vice, those that do not desire excitement after an interval of repose. It is only those in whom the need of excitement is a disease that feel the tranquility which follows excitement dull and insipid, instead of pleasurable in direct proportion to the excitement which preceded it. When people who are tolerably fortunate in their outward lot do not find in life sufficient enjoyment to make it valuable to them, the cause generally is caring for nobody but themselves. To those who have neither public nor private affectations, the excitements of life are much curtailed, and in any case dwindle in value as the time approaches when all selfish interests must be terminated by death. While those who leave after them objects of personal affection, especially those who have also cultivated a fellow feeling with the collective interests of mankind, retain as lively an interest in life on the eve of death as in the vigor of youth and health. Next is selfishness. The principal cause which makes life unsatisfactory is want of mental cultivation. A cultivated mind, I do not mean that of a philosopher, but any mind to which the fountains of knowledge have been opened, and which has been taught in any tolerable degree to exercise its faculties, finds sources of inexhaustible interest in all that surrounds it, in the objects of nature, the achievements of art, the imaginations of poetry, the incidents of history, the ways of mankind, past and present, and their prospects in the future. It is possible indeed to become indifferent to all this, and that too without having exhausted a thousandth part of it, but only when one has from the beginning no moral or human interest in these things, and has sought in them only the gratification of curiosity. Now, there is absolutely no reason in the nature of things why an amount of mental culture sufficient to give an intelligent interest in these objects of contemplation should not be the inheritance of every one born in a civilized country, as little as there is an inherent necessity that any human being should be a selfish egoist, devoid of every feeling of care but those which center on his own miserable individuality. Something far superior to this is sufficiently common even now, to give ample earnest of what the human species may be made. Genuine private affections. I was reading that wrong. That is affections, not affectations. Genuine private affections and a sincere interest in the public good are possible, though in unequal degrees, to every rightly brought up human being. In a world in which there is so much to interest, so much to enjoy, and so much also to correct and improve, every one who has this moderate amount of moral and intellectual requisites is capable of an existence which may be called enviable, and unless such a person, through bad laws or subjection to the will of others, is denied the liberty to use the sources of happiness within his reach, he will not fail to find this enviable existence. If he escape the positive evils of the life, the great sources of physical and mental suffering, such as indigence, disease, and the unkindness, worthlessness, or premature loss of objects of affection. The main stress of the problem lies, therefore, in the contest with these calamities, from which it is a rare good fortune entirely to escape, which, as things are now, cannot be obviated, and often cannot be in any material degree mitigated. Yet no one whose opinion deserves a moment's consideration can doubt that most of the great positive evils of the world are in themselves removable, and will, if human affairs continue to improve, be in the end reduced within narrow limits. Poverty, in any sense implying suffering, may be completely extinguished by the wisdom of society combined with the good sense and providence of individuals. Even that most intractable of enemies, disease, may be infinitely reduced in dimensions by good physical and moral education and the proper control of noxious influences, while the progress of science holds out a promise for the future of still more direct conquest over this detestable foe. And every advance in that direction relieves us from some, not only of the chances which cut short our own lives, but what concerns us still more, which will deprive us of those in whom our happiness is wrapped up. As for vicissitudes of fortune and other disappointments connected with worldly circumstances, these are principally the effect either of gross impotence, of ill-regulated desires, of bad or imperfect social institutions. All the grand sources, in short, of human suffering are in a great degree, many of them entirely, conquerable by human care and effort, and though the removal is grievously slow, though a long succession of generations will perish in the breach before the conquest is completed, and this world becomes all that, if will and knowledge were not wanting, it might easily be made, yet every mind sufficiently and generous to bear a part. Yet every mind sufficiently intelligent and generous to bear a part, however small and inconspicuous in the endeavor, will draw a noble enjoyment from the contest itself, which he would not for any bribe in the form of selfish indulgence to consent to be without. I'm gonna need a moment. Drink water and clear my eyes. Right. And this leads to the true estimation of what is said by the objectors concerning the possibility and the obligation of learning to do without happiness. Unquestionably, it is possible to do without happiness. It is done involuntarily by 19/20ths of mankind, even in those parts of our present world which are least deep in barbarism, and it often has to be done voluntarily by the hero or the martyr, for the sake of something which he prizes more than his individual happiness. But this something, what it is, unless the happiness of others or some of But this something, what is it unless the happiness of others or some of the requisites of happiness? It is noble to be capable of resigning entirely one's own portion of happiness or chances of it, but after all, this self-sacrifice must be for some end, and if it is not its own end, and if we are told that its end is not happiness but virtue, which is better than happiness, I ask, would the sacrifice be made if the hero or martyr did not believe that it would earn for others immunity from similar sacrifices? Would it be made if he thought that his renunciation of happiness for himself would produce no fruit for any of his fellow creatures, but to make their lot like his, and place them also in the condition of persons who have renounced happiness? All honor to those who can abnegate for themselves the personal enjoyment of life, when by such renunciation they contribute worthily to increase the amount of happiness in the world. But he who does it, or professes to do it, for any other purpose, is no more deserving of admiration than the Aztec mounted on his pillar. He may be an inspiring proof of what men can do, but assuredly not an example of what they should. Though it is only in a very imperfect state of the world's arrangements that anyone can best serve the happiness of others by the absolute sacrifice of his own, so long as the world is yet in that imperfect state, I fully acknowledge that the readiness to make a sacrifice is the highest virtue which can be found in man. I will add that in this condition of the world, paradoxical as the assertion may be, the conscious ability to do without happiness gives the best prospect of realizing such happiness as is attainable. For nothing except that consciousness can raise a person above the chances of life, by making him feel that, let fate and fortune do their worst, they have not power to subdue him, which, once felt, frees him from excess of anxiety concerning the evils of life, and enables him, like many a Stoic in the worst times of the Roman Empire, to cultivate in tranquillity the sources of satisfaction accessible to him, without concerning himself about the uncertainty of their duration any more than about their inevitable end. Meanwhile, let utilitarians never cease to claim the morality of self-devotion as a possession which belongs by as good a right to them, and as either to the Stoic or the transcendentalist. The utilitarian morality does recognize in human beings the power of sacrificing their own greatest good for the good of others. It only refuses to admit that the sacrifice itself is a good, a sacrifice which does not increase or tend to increase the total sum of happiness it considers as wasted. The only self-renunciation it applauds is devotion to the happiness or to some of the means of happiness of others, either of mankind collectively or of individuals within the limits imposed by the collective interests of mankind. I must again repeat what the assailants of utilitarianism seldom have the justice to acknowledge, that the happiness which forms the utilitarian standard of what is right in conduct is not the agent's own happiness, but that of all considered, but that of all concerned. As between his own happiness and that of others, utilitarianism requires him to be as strictly impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectre. In the golden rule of Jesus of Nazareth, we read the complete spirit of the ethics of utility. To do as you would be done by, and to love your neighbor as yourself, constitute the ideal perfection of utilitarian morality. As the means of making the nearest approach to this ideal, utility would enjoin first that laws and social arrangements should place the happiness, or as speaking practically it may be called, the interest of every individual as nearly as possible in harmony with the interest of the whole, and secondly, that education and opinion, which have so vast a power over human character, should so use that power to establish in the mind of every individual an indissoluble association between his own happiness and the good of the whole, especially between his own happiness and the practice of such modes of conduct, negative and positive, as regard for the universal happiness prescribes, so that not only he may be unable to conceive the possibility of happiness to himself consistently with a conduct opposed to the greater good, but also that a direct impulse to promote the general good may be in every one of the habitual motives of action, and sentiments connected therewith may fill a large and prominent place in every human being's sentient existence. If the impugners of the utilitarian morality represented to it their own minds in this its true character, I know not what recommendation possessed by any other morality they could possibly affirm to be wanting to it, what more beautiful or more exalted developments of human nature any other ethical system can be supposed to foster, or what springs of action not accessible to the utilitarian such systems rely on for giving effect to their mandates. The objectors to utilitarianism cannot always be charged with representing it in a discreditable light. On the contrary, those among them who entertain anything like a just idea of its disinterested character sometimes find fault with its standard as being too high for humanity. They say it is exacting too much to require that people shall always act from the inducement of promoting the general interests of society. But this is to mistake the very meaning of a standard of morals, and confound the rule of action with the motive of it. It is the business of ethics to tell us what our duties are, or by what tests we may know them. But no system of ethics requires it that the sole motive of all we do shall be a feeling of duty. On the contrary, 99/100 of all our actions are done from other motives, and rightly so done, if the rule of duty does not condemn them. It is the more unjust to utilitarianism that this particular misapprehension should be made a ground of objection to it, inasmuch as utilitarian moralists have gone beyond almost all others in affirming that the motive has nothing to do with the morality of the action, though much with the worth of the agent. He who saves a fellow creature from drowning does what is morally right, whether his motive be duty or the hope of being paid for his trouble. He who betrays the friend that trusts him is guilty of a crime, even if his object be to serve another friend to whom he is under greater obligations. But to speak only of actions done from the motive of duty and in direct obedience to principle it is a misapprehension of the utilitarian mode of thought, to conceive it as implying that people should fix their minds upon so wide a generality as the world or society at large. The great majority of good actions are intended not for the benefit of the world, but for that of individuals, of which the good of the world is made up, and the thoughts of the most virtuous man need not on these occasions travel beyond the particular persons concerned, except so far as is necessary to assure himself that in benefiting them he is not violating the rights, that is, the legitimate and authorized expectations of anyone else. That's an interesting definition of rights. The multiplication of happiness is, according to the utilitarian ethics, the object of virtue. The occasions on which any person, except 1 in 1,000, has it in his power to do this on an extended scale, in other words, to be a public benefactor, are but exceptional. And on these occasions alone he is called on to consider public utility. In every other case, private utility. The interest or happiness of some few persons is all he has to attend to. Those alone, the influence of whose actions extend to society in general, need concern themselves habitually about so large an object. In the case of abstinences, indeed, of things which people forbear to do from moral considerations, though the consequences in the particular case might be beneficial, it would be unworthy of an intelligent agent not to be consciously aware that the action is of a class which, if practiced generally, would be generally injurious, and that this is the ground of the obligation to abstain from it. The amount of regard for the public interest implied in this recognition is no greater than is demanded by every system of morals, for they all enjoin to abstain from whatever is manifestly pernicious to society. The same considerations depose of another reproach against the doctrine of utility, founded on a still grosser misconception of the purchase of a standard of morality, and of the very meaning of the words right and wrong. It is often affirmed that utilitarianism renders men cold and unsympathizing, that it chills their moral feelings towards individuals, that it makes them regard only the dry and hard consideration of the consequences of actions, not taking into their moral estimate the qualities from which these actions emanate. If the assertion means that they do not follow their judgment respecting the rightness or wrongness of an action to be influenced by their opinion of the qualities of the person who does it, this is a complaint not against utilitarianism, but against having any standard of morality at all, for certainly no known ethical standard decides an action to be good or bad because it is done by a good or bad man, still less because done by an amiable, still less because done by an amiable, a brave, or benevolent man, or the contrary. These considerations are relevant not to the estimation of actions but of persons, and there is nothing in the utilitarian theory inconsistent with the fact that there are other things which interest us in persons beyond the rightness and wrongness of their actions. The Stoics, indeed, with the paradoxical misuse of language which was part of their system, and by which they strove to raise themselves above all concern anything but virtue, were fond of saying that he who has that has everything, that he, and only he, is rich, is beautiful, is a king. But no claim of this description is made for the virtuous man by utilitarian doctrine. Utilitarians are quite aware that there are other desirous possessions and qualities besides virtue, and are perfectly willing to allow all of them their full worth. They are also aware that a right action does not necessarily indicate a virtuous character, and that actions which are blamable often proceed from qualities entitled to praise. When this is apparent in any particular case, it modifies their estimation, not certainly of the act, but of the agent. I grant that they are, notwithstanding, of opinion that in the long run the best proof of a good character is good actions, and resolutely refuse to consider any mental disposition as good, which is the prominent tendency of which the predominant tendencies produce bad conduct. This makes them unpopular with many people, but it is an unpopularity that they must share with everyone who regards the distinction between right and wrong in a serious light, and the reproach is not one which a conscientious utilitarian need be anxious to repel. If no more be meant by the objection that many utilitarians look on the morality of actions as measured by the utilitarian standard with too exclusive a regard, and do not lay sufficient stress upon the other beauties of character which go towards making a human being lovable or admirable, this may be admitted. Utilitarians who have cultivated their moral feelings, but not their sympathies nor their artistic perceptions, do fall into this mistake, and so do all other moralists under the same conditions. What can be said in excuse for other moralists is equally available for them, namely, that if there is to be any error, it is better that it should be on that side. As a matter of fact, we may affirm that among utilitarians, as among adherents of other systems, there is every imaginable degree of rigidity and of laxity in the application of their standard. Some are even puritanically rigorous, while others are indulgent as can possibly be desired by sinner or by sentimentalist. But on the whole, a doctrine which brings prominently forward the interest that mankind has in the repression and prevention of conduct which violates the moral law is likely to be inferior to no other in turning the sanctions of opinion against such violations. It is true, the question, what does violate the moral law, is one on which those who recognize different standards of morality are likely now and then to differ. But difference of opinion on moral questions was not first introduced to the world by utilitarianism, while that doctrine does supply, if not always an easy, at all events a tangible and intelligible mode of deciding such differences. It may not be superfluous to notice more than a few more of the common misapprehensions of utilitarian ethics, even those which are so obvious and gross that it might appear impossible for any person of candor and intelligence to fall into them, since persons, even of considerable mental endowments, often give themselves so little trouble to understand the bearings of any opinion against which they entertain a prejudice, and men are in general so little conscious of this voluntary ignorance as a defect, that the vulgarest misunderstandings of ethical doctrines are continually met with in the deliberate writings of persons of the greatest pretensions both to high principle and to philosophy. We not uncommonly hear the doctrine of utility inveighed against it as a godless doctrine. If it be necessary to say anything at all against so mere an assumption, we say that the question depends upon the idea of what we have formed of the moral character of the deity. If it be a true belief that God desires above all things the happiness of his creations, and that this was his purpose in their creation, utility is not only a godless doctrine, but more profoundly religious than any other. If it be meant that utilitarianism does not recognize the revealed word of God as the supreme law of morals, I answer that a utilitarian who believes in the perfect goodness and wisdom of God necessarily believes that whatever God has thought fit to reveal on the subject of morals must fulfill the requirements of utility in a supreme degree. But others besides utilitarians have been of the opinion that the Christian revelation was intended and is fitted to inform the hearts and minds of mankind with a spirit which should enable them to find for themselves what is right and incline them to do it when found, rather than to tell them, except in a very general way, what it is, and that we need a doctrine of ethics carefully followed out to interpret to us the will of God. Whether this opinion is correct or not, it is superfluous here to discuss, since whatever aid religion, whether natural or revealed, can afford to ethical investigation is as open to the utilitarian moralist as to any other. He can use it as the testimony of God to the usefulness or hurtfulness of any course of action. But by as good a right as others can use it for the indication of a transcendental law having no connection with utility or with happiness. Again, utility is similarly stigmatized as an immoral doctrine by giving it the name of expediency, and taking advantage of the popular use of that term to contrast it with principle. But the expedient, in the sense in which it is opposed to the right, generally means that which is expedient for the particular interest of the agent himself, when a minister sacrifices the interests of his country to keep himself in place. When that means anything better than this, it means that which is expedient for some immediate object, some temporary purpose, but which violates a rule whose observance is expedient in a much higher degree. The expedient, in this sense, instead of being the same thing with the useful, is a branch of the hurtful. Thus, it would be expedient for the purpose of getting over some momentary embarrassment, or attaining some object immediately useful to ourselves or others, to tell a lie. But inasmuch as the cultivation of in ourselves of a sensitive feeling on the subject of veracity is one of the most useful, and the enfeeblement of that feeling one of the most hurtful things to which our conduct can be instrumental, and inasmuch as any, even unintentional, deviation from truth does that much towards weakening the trustworthiness of human assertion, which is not only the principal support of all present social well-being, but the insufficiency of which does more than any one thing that can be named to keep back civilization, virtue, everything on which human happiness on the largest scale depends. We feel that the violation, for a present advantage, of a rule of such transcendent expediency is not expedient, and that he who, for the sake of a convenience to himself or to some other individual, does that which depends on him to deprive mankind of the good and inflict upon them the evil, involved in the greater or less reliance which they can place in each other's word, acts the part of one of their worst enemies. That was a long sentence. Whatever. Yet even this rule, sacred as it is, admits of possible exceptions, is acknowledged by all moralists, the chief of which is when the withholding of some fact, as of information from a malefactor or of bad news from a person dangerously ill, would save an individual, especially an individual other than oneself, from great and unmerited evil, and when the withholding can only be effected by denial. But in order that the exception may not extend itself beyond the need, and may have the least possible effect in weakening reliance on veracity, it ought to be recognized, and, if possible, its limits defined. And if the principle of utility is good for anything, it must be good for weighing these conflicting utilities against one another, and marking out the region within which one or the other preponderates. Again, defenders of utility often find themselves called upon to reply to such objections as this, that there is not time, previous to action, for calculating and weighing the effects of any line of conduct on the general happiness. That is exactly as if anyone were to say that it is impossible to guide our conduct by Christianity, because there is not time, on every occasion which anything has to be done, to read through the Old and New Testaments. The answer to the objection is that there has been ample time, namely, the whole past duration of the human species. During all that time, mankind has been learning by experience the tendencies of action on which experience all the prudence as well as the morality of life are dependent. People talk as if the commencement of this course of experience has hitherto been put off, And as if, at the moment when some man feels tempted to meddle with the property or life of another, he had to begin considering for the first time whether murder and theft are injurious to human happiness. Even then, I do not think that he would find the question very puzzling, but at all events, the matter is now done by his hand. It is truly a whimsical supposition that if mankind were agreed in considering utility to be the test of morality, that they would remain without any agreement as to what is useful, and would take no measures for having their notions on the subject taught to the young, and enforced by law and opinion. There is no difficulty in proving any ethical standard whatsoever to work ill, if we suppose that universal idiocy must be conjoined with it. But on any hypothesis short of that, mankind must by this time have acquired positive beliefs as to the effects of some actions on their happiness, and the beliefs which have thus come down are the rules of morality for the multitude, and for the philosopher until he has succeeded in finding better. That philosophers might easily do this, even now, on many subjects, that the received code of ethics is by no means of divine right, and that mankind still have much to learn as to the effects of actions on general happiness, I admit, or rather earnestly maintain. The corollaries from the principle of utility, like the precepts of every practical art, admit of an indefinite improvement, and in a progressive state of the human mind, their improvement is perpetually going on. But to consider the rules of morality as improvable is one thing. To test over the intermediate generalizations entirely, and endeavor to test each individual action directly by the first principle is another. It is a strange notion that the acknowledgment of a first principle is inconsistent with the admission of secondary ones. To inform a traveler respecting the place of his ultimate destination is to not forbid the use of landmarks and direction posts on the way. The proposition that happiness is the end and aim of morality does not mean that no road ought to be laid down to that goal, or that persons going thither should not be advised to take one direction rather than another. Men really ought to leave off talking a kind of nonsense on this subject when they would neither talk nor listen to on other matters of practical concernment. Nobody argues that the art of navigation is not founded on astronomy, because sailors cannot wait to calculate the nautical almanac. Being rational creatures, they go to sea with it ready calculated, and all rational creatures go out upon the sea of life with their minds made up on the more common questions of right and wrong, as well as many of the far more difficult questions of wise and foolish. And this, as long as foresight is a human quality, is to be presumed they will continue to do so. Whatever we adopt as the fundamental principle of morality, we require subordinate principles to apply it by. The impossibility of doing without them, being common to all systems, can afford no argument against any one in particular, but gravely to argue as if no secondary principles could be had, and as if mankind had remained till now, and must always remain, without drawing any general conclusions from the experience of human life, is as high a pitch, I think, as absurdity has ever reached in philosophical controversy. The remainder of the stock arguments against utilitarianism mostly consist in laying to its charge the common infirmities of human nature, and the general difficulties which embarrass conscientious persons in shaping their course through life. We are told that a utilitarian will be apt to make his own particular case an exception to moral rules, and, when under temptation, will see a utility in the breach of a rule greater than he will see in its observance. But is utility the only creed which is able to furnish us with excuses for evil doing and the means of cheating our own conscience? They are afforded in abundance by all doctrines, which recognize as a fact in morals the existence of conflicting considerations, which all doctrines do, that have been believed by sane persons. It is not the fault of any creed, but of the complicated nature of human affairs, that rules of conduct cannot be so framed as to require no exceptions, and that hardly can any kind of action be safely laid down as either always obligatory or always condemnable. There is no ethical creed which does not temper the rigidity of its laws by giving a certain latitude, under the moral responsibility of the agent, for accommodations to peculiarities of circumstance. And under any creed, at the opening thus made, self-deception and dishonest casuistry get in. There exists no moral system under which there do not arise unequivocal cases of conflicting obligation. These are the real difficulties, the knotty points both in the theory of ethics and in the conscientious guidance of personal conduct. They are overcome practically, with greater or less success, according to the intellect and virtue of the individual, but it can hardly be pretended that anyone will be the less qualified for dealing with them, from possessing an ultimate standard to which conflicting rights and duties can be referred. If voidity is the ultimate source of moral obligations, utility. Back to the beginning of the sentence. They are overcome practically with greater or less success according to the intellect and virtue of the individual, but it can hardly be pretended that anyone will be the less qualified for dealing with them from possessing an ultimate standard to which conflicting rights and duties can be referred. If utility is the ultimate source of moral obligations, utility may be invoked to decide between them when their demands are incompatible. Though the application of the standard may be difficult, it is better than none at all. While in other systems the moral laws all claiming independent authority, there is no common umpire entitled to interfere between them. Their claims to precedence one over another rest on little better than sophistry, and unless determined, as they generally are, by the unacknowledged influence of considerations of utility, afford a free scope for the actions of personal desires and partialities. We must remember that only in these cases of conflict between secondary principles is it requisite that first principles should be appealed to. There is no case of moral obligation in which some secondary principle is not involved, and if only one, there can seldom be any real doubt which one it is, in the mind of any person by whom the principle itself is recognized. All right. That's the end of the chapter. Let's take 5, get up, get stretched, and we will be back shortly. Alrighty, Chapter 3 of the ultimate sanction of the principle of utility. The question is often asked, and properly so, in regard to any supposed moral standard. What is its sanction? What are the motives to obey it? And more specifically, what is the surface of its obligation? Whence does it derive its binding force? It is a necessary part of moral philosophy to provide the answer to this question, which, though frequently assuming the shape of an objection to the utilitarian morality, as if it had some special applicability to that above others, really rises in regards to all standards. It arises, in fact, whenever a person is called on to adopt a standard, or refer morality to any basis on which he has not been accustomed to rest it. For the customary morality, that which education of opinion have consecrated, is the only one which presents itself to the mind with the feeling of being in itself obligatory. And when a person is asked to believe that this morality derives its obligation from some general principle round which the custom has not thrown the same halo, the assertion is to him a paradox. The supposed corollaries that have a more binding force than the original theorem, the superstructure seems to stand better without than with what is represented as its foundation. He says to himself, I feel I am bound not to rob or murder, betray or deceive, but why am I bound to promote the general happiness? If my own happiness lies in something else, why may I not give that the preference? If the view adopted by the utilitarian philosophy of the nature of the moral sense be correct, this difficulty will always present itself until the influences which form moral character have taken the same hold of the principle which they have taken hold of the consequences. Until, by the improvement of education, the feeling of unity with our character, with our fellow creatures, shall be, what it cannot be denied that Christ intended it to be, as deeply rooted in our character and to our own consciousness as completely a part of our own nature as the horror of crime is in an ordinarily well brought up young person. In the meantime, however, the difficulty has no particular application to the doctrine of utility, but is inherent in every attempt to analyze morality and reduce it to principles, which, unless the principle is already in men's minds invested with as much sacredness as any of its application, always seems to divest them of a particular part of their sanctity. The principle of utility either has, or there is no reason why it might not have, all the sanctions which belong to any other system of morals. These sanctions are either external or internal. Of the external sanctions it is not necessary to speak at any length. They are the hope of favor and the fear of displeasure from our fellow creatures or from the ruler of the universe, along with whatever we may have of sympathy or affection for them, or of love and of awe of him, inclining us to do his will independently of these selfish consequences. There is evidently no reason why all these motives for observance should not attach themselves to the utilitarian morality as completely and as powerfully as any other. Indeed, those of them which refer to our general creatures are sure to do so in proportion to the amount of general intelligence, for whether there be any other ground of moral obligation than the general happiness or not, men do desire happiness. And however imperfect may be their own practice, they desire and command all conduct in others towards themselves, by which they think their happiness is promoted. With regard to the religious motive, if men believe, as most profess to do, in the goodness of God, those who think that conduciveness to the general happiness is the essence, or even only the criterion of good, must therefore believe it is also that which God approves. The whole force, therefore, of external reward and punishment, whether physical or moral, and whether proceeding from God or our fellow man, together with all that the capacities of human nature admit of disinterested devotion to either, become available to enforce the utilitarian morality, in proposition as that morality is recognized, and the more powerfully, the more appliances of education and general cultivation are bent to the purpose. So far as to external standards, the internal sanction of duty, whatever our standard of duty may be, is one and the same, a feeling in our own mind, a pain, more or less intense, attendant on violation of duty, which in properly cultivated moral natures rises, in the more serious cases, into shrinking from it as an impossibility. This feeling, when disinterested and connecting itself with the pure idea of duty and not with some particular form of it, or with any of the merely accessory circumstances, is actually the essence of conscience. Though, in that complex phenomenon as it actually exists, the simple fact is, in general, all encrusted over with collateral associations, derived from sympathy, from love, and still more from fear, from all the forms of religious feeling, from the recollections of childhood and of all our past life, from self-esteem, desire of the esteem of others, and occasionally even self-abasement. This extreme compilation is, I apprehend, the origin of the sort of mystical character by which a tendency of the human mind, of which there are many other examples, is apt to be attributed to the idea of moral obligation, and which leads people to believe that the idea cannot possibly attach itself to any other objects than those which, by a supposed mysterious law, are found in our present experience to excite it. Its binding force, however, consists in the existence of a mass of feeling which must be broken through in order to do what violates our standard of right, and which, if we do nonetheless violate that standard, will probably have to be encountered afterwards in the form of remorse. Whatever theory we have of the nature or origin of conscience is what ultimately constitutes it. The ultimate sanction, therefore, of all morality, external motives apart, is being a subjective feeling in our own minds. I see nothing embarrassing to those whose standard is utility in the question, what is the sanction of that particular standard? We may answer, the same as of all other moral standards, the conscientious feelings of mankind. Doubtlessly, the sanction has no binding efficacy on those who do not possess the feelings it appeals to, but neither will those persons be any more obedient to any other moral principle than to the utilitarian one. On then, morality of any kind has no hold but through the external sanctions. Meanwhile, the feelings exist, a fact in human nature, the reality of which and the great power with which they are capable of acting on in those whom they have been duly cultivated is proved by experience. No reason has ever been shown why may not be cultivated as to great intensity in connection with the utilitarian as with any other rule of morals. There is, I am aware, a disposition to believe that a person who sees in moral obligation a transcendental fact, an objective reality belonging to the province of things in themselves, is likely to be more obedient to it than one who believes it to be entirely subjective, having its seat in human consciousness only. But whatever a person's opinion may be on this feeling of ontology, the force he is really urged by is his own subjective feeling, and is exactly measured by its strength. No one's belief that duty is an objective reality is stronger than the belief that God is so. Yet the belief in God, apart from the expectation of actual reward and punishment, only operates on conduct through and in proportion to the subjective religious feeling. Right. There is it's alright. back at the beginning of the page. There is, I am aware, a disposition to believe that a person who sees a moral obligation a transcendental fact, an objective reality belonging to the province of things in themselves, is likely to be more obedient to it than one who believes it to be entirely subjective, having its seat in human consciousness only. But whatever a person's opinion may be on this point of ontology, the force he is really urged by is his own subjective feeling, and is exactly measured by its strength. No one's belief that duty is an objective reality is stronger than the belief that God is so. Yet the belief in God, apart from the expectation of actual reward and punishment, only operates on conduct through and in proportion to the subjective religious feeling. The sanction, so far as it is disinterested, is always in the mind itself, and the notion, therefore, of the transcendental moralist must be that the sanction will not exist in the mind unless it is believed to have its root out of the mind, and that if a person is able to say to himself, "This which is restraining me, and which is called my conscience, is only a feeling in my own mind," he may possibly draw the conclusion that when the feeling ceases, the obligation ceases, and that if he find the feeling inconvenient, he may disregard it, and endeavor to get rid of it. But is this danger confined to the utilitarian morality? Does the belief that moral obligation has its seat outside the mind make the feeling of it too strong to be got rid of? The fact is so far otherwise that all moralists admit and lament the ease with which, in the generality of minds, conscience can be silenced or stifled. The question, "Need I obey my conscience?" is quite as often put to themselves by persons who have never heard of the principle of utility as by adherents. Those with conscientious feelings are so weak as to allow of their asking this question if they answer it affirmatively, will not do so because they believe in the transcendental theory, but because of the external sanctions. It is not necessary for the present purpose to decide whether the feeling of duty is innate or implanted. Assuming it to be innate, it is an open question as to what objects it naturally attaches itself, for the philosophic supporters of that theory are now agreed that the intuitive perception is of principles of morality and not of the details. If there be anything innate in the matter, I see no reason why the feeling which is innate should not be that of regard to the pleasures and pains of others. If there is any principle of morals which is intuitively obligatory, I should say that it must be it. If so, the intuitive ethics would coincide with the utilitarian, and there would be no further quarrel between them. Even as it is, the intuitive moralists, though they already believe there are other intuitive moral obligations, do already believe this to be one. For they unanimously hold that a large portion of morality turns upon the consideration due to the interests of our fellow creatures. Therefore, if the belief in the transcendental origin of moral obligation gives any additional efficacy to the internal sanction, it appears to me that the utilitarian principle already has benefit of it. On the other hand, if, as is my own belief, the moral feelings are not innate but acquired, they are not for that reason the less natural. It is natural to speak, to reason, to build cities, to cultivate the ground, though these are acquired faculties. The moral feelings are not indeed part of our nature, in the sense of being at any perceptible degree present in all of us. But this unhappily is a fact admitted by those who believe the most strenuously in their transcendental origin. Like the other acquired capacities above referred to, the moral capacity, if not part of our nature, is a natural outgrowth from it, capable, like them, in a certain small degree, of springing up spontaneously, and susceptible of being brought about by cultivation to a high degree of development. Unhappily, it is also susceptible, by a sufficient use of the external sanctions and of the force of early impressions, of being cultivated in almost any direction, so that there is hardly anything so absurd or so mischievous that it may not, by means of those influences, be made to act on the human mind with all the authority of conscience. To doubt that the same potency might be given the same means to the principle of utility, even if it had no foundation in human nature, would be flying in the face of all experience. But moral associations, which are wholly of artificial creation, when intellectual goes on, yield by degrees to the solving to the dissolving force of analysis, and the feeling of a duty, when associated with utility, would appear equally arbitrary. If there were no leading department of our nature, no powerful class of sentiments with which that association would harmonize, which would make us feel it congenial, and incline in us not only to foster it in others, for which we have abundant interested motives, but to cherish it in ourselves, if there were not, in short, a natural basis of sentiment for utilitarian morality, it might well happen that this association also, even after it had been implanted by education, might be analyzed away. Water. But there is this basis of powerful natural sentiment, and this it is which, when once the general happiness is recognized as the ethical standard, will constitute the strength of the utilitarian morality. This firm foundation is that of the social feelings of mankind, the desire to be in unity with our fellow creatures, which is already a powerful principle in human nature, and happily one of those which tend to become stronger, even without express inoculation, from the influences of advancing civilization. The social state is at once so natural, so necessary, and so habitual to man, that, except in some unusual circumstances, or by an effort of voluntary abstraction, he never conceives himself otherwise than as a member of a body, and this association is riveted more and more as mankind are further removed from the state of savage independence. Any condition, therefore, which is essential to the state of society, becomes more and more an inseparable part of every person's conception of the state of things which he is born into, and which is the destiny of a human being. Now, society between human beings, except in the relation of master and slave, is manifestly impossible on any other footing than that the interests of all are to be consulted. I do not condone slavery. It is not helpful, it is not useful, and presumably is even actually against the utilitarianism we are reading about. Society between equals can only exist on the understanding that the interests of all are to be regarded equally, and since in the states of civilization every person except an absolute monarch has equals, every one is obligated to live on these terms with somebody, and in every age some advance is made towards a state in which it will be impossible to live permanently on other terms with anybody. In this way, people grow up unable to conceive as possible to them a state of total disregard of other people's interests. They are under a necessity of conceiving themselves as at least abstaining from all the grosser injuries, and, if only for their own protection, living in a state of constant protest against them. They are also familiar with the fact of cooperating with others, and proposing to themselves a collective, not an individual interest as the aim, at least for the time being, of their actions. So long as they are cooperating, their ends are identified with those of others. There is at least a temporary feeling that the interests of others are their own interests. Not only does all strengthening of social ties, and all healthy growth of society, give to each individual a stronger personal interest in practically consulting the welfare of others, it also leads him to identify his feelings more and more with their good, or at least comes with a greater degree of physical consideration for it. He comes, as though instinctively, to be conscious of himself as a feeling who, of course, pays regard to others. The good of others becomes to him a thing naturally and necessarily to be attended to, like any of the physical conditions of our existence. Now, whatever amount of this feeling a person has, he is urged by the strongest motives both of interest and of sympathy to demonstrate it, and to the utmost of his power encourage it in others. And even if he has none of it himself, he is as greatly interested in anyone else that others should have it. Consequently, the smallest germs of the feeling are laid hold of and nourished by the contagion of sympathy and the influences of education, and a complete web of corroborative association is woven round it by the powerful agency of the external sanctions. This mode of conceiving ourselves in human life as civilization goes on is found to be more and more natural. Every step in political improvement renders it more so by removing the sources of opposition and of interest and leveling those inequalities of illegal privilege between individuals or classes, owing to which there are large portions of mankind whose happiness it is still practicable to disregard. In an improving state of the human mind, the influences are constantly on the increase, which tend to generate in each individual a feeling of unity with all the rest, which, if perfect, would make him never think of or desire any beneficial condition for himself, and the benefits of which they are not included. If we now suppose this feeling of unity to be taught as a religion, and the whole force of education, of institutions, and of opinion directed, as was once in the case of religion, to make every person grow up from infancy surrounded on all sides by both the profession and the practice of it, I think that no one who can realize this conception will feel any givings about the sufficiency of the ultimate sanction for the happiness morality. To any ethical student who finds the realization difficult, I recommend, as a means of facilitating it, the second of M. Comte's two principal works, the Traité de politique positive. I think it's French. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce it. I entertain the strongest objections to the system of politics and morals sent forth in that treatise, but I think it has superabundantly shown that the possibility of giving to the service of humanity, even without the aid of belief in a providence, both the psychological power and the social efficacy of religion, making it take hold of human life and color all thought, feeling, and action in a manner of which the greatest ascendancy ever exercised by any religion may be but a type and foretaste, and of which the danger is, not that it should be insufficient, but that it should be so excessive as to interfere unduly with human freedom and individuality. Neither is it necessary to the feeling which constitutes the binding force of the utilitarian morality on those who recognize it, to wait for those social influences which would make its obligation felt by mankind at large. In the comparatively early state of human advancement in which we now live, a human cannot indeed feel that entireness of sympathy with all others, which would make any real discordance in the general direction of their conduct in life impossible. But already a person in whom the societal feeling is at all developed cannot bring himself to think of his fellow creatures as struggling rivals with him for the means of happiness, whom he must desire to see defeated in their object in order that he may succeed in his. The deeply rooted conception which every individual even now has of himself as a social being tends to make him feel it one of his natural wants that there should be harmony between his feelings and aims and those of his fellow creatures. If differences of opinion and of mental culture make it impossible for him to share many other actual feelings, perhaps make him denounce and defy those feelings, he still needs to be conscious about that his real aim, and theirs do not afflict, that he is not opposing himself to what they really wish for, namely their own good, but is, on the contrary, promoting it. This feeling in most individuals is much inferior in strength to their selfish feelings, and is found wanting altogether. But to those who have it, it possesses all the characters of a natural feeling. It does not present itself to their minds as a superstition of education, or as a law despotically imposed by the power of society, but as an attribute it would not be well for them to be without. This conviction is the ultimate sanction of the greatest happiness morality. That this is it which makes my mind of any well-developed feelings. This it is which makes any mind of well-developed feelings work with and not against the outward motives to care for others, afforded by what I have called the external sanctions, and when those sanctions are wanting or act in an opposite direction, constitutes in itself a powerful internal binding force, in proportion to the sensitiveness and thoughtfulness of the character, since few but those whose mind is a moral blank could bear to lay out the course of their life on the plan of paying no regard to others except so far as their own private interest compels. Chapter 4. Of what sort of proof the principle of utility is susceptible. It has already been remarked that questions of ultimate ends do not admit of proof in the ordinary acceptation of the term. Acceptation of the term. To be incapable of proof by reasoning is common to all first principles, to the first premises of our knowledge as well as those of our conduct. But the former, being masters of fact, may be the subject of a direct appeal to the faculties which judge fact, namely our senses and our internal consciousness. Can an appeal be made to the same faculties on questions of practical ends, or by what other faculty is cognizance taken of them? Questions about ends are, in other words, questions what things are desirable. The utilitarian doctrine is that happiness is desirable, and the only thing desirable, as an end. All other things being only desirable as means to that end. What ought to be required of this doctrine? What conditions is it requisite that the doctrine should fulfill to make good its claim to be believed? The only proof capable of being given is that an object is visible. The only proof capable of being given that an object is visible is that people actually see it. The only proof that a sound is audible is that people hear it, and so on the other sources of our experience. In like manner, I apprehend that the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people do actually desire it. If the end which the utilitarian doctrine proposes to itself were not, in theory and in practice, acknowledged to be an end, nothing could ever convince any person it was so. No reason can be given why the general happiness is desirable, except that each person, so far as he believes it to be attainable, desires his own happiness. This, however, being a fact, we have not only all the proof of which the case admits of, but all of which it is possible to require. That happiness is a good, that each person's happiness is a good to that person, and the general happiness, therefore, a good to the aggregate of all persons. Happiness has made out its title as one of the ends of conduct, and consequently one of the criteria of morality. But it has not, by this alone, proved itself to be the sole criterion. To do that, it would seem, by the same rule, necessary to show not only that people desire happiness, but that they never desire anything else. Now, it is palpable that they do desire things which, in common language, are decidedly distinguished from happiness. They desire, for example, virtue and the absence of vice, no less really than pleasure and the absence of pain. The desire of virtue is not as universal, but it is as an authentic a fact as the desire of happiness, and hence the opponents of the utilitarian standard deem that they have a right to infer that there are other ends of human action besides happiness, and that happiness is not the standard of approbation and disapprobation. But where does the utilitarian doctrine deny that people desire virtue, or maintain that virtue is not a thing to be desired? The very reverse. It maintains not only that virtue is to be desired, but that it is to be desired disinterestedly for itself. Whatever may be the opinion of utilitarian moralists as to the original conditions by which virtue is made virtue, however they may believe, as they do, that actions and dispositions are only virtuous because they promote another end than virtue, yet this being granted, and it having been decided from considerations of the description what is virtuous, they not only place virtue at the very head of things which are good as means to the ultimate end, but they also recognize as a psychological fact the possibility of its being to the individual a good in itself, without looking to any end beyond it, and hold that the mind is not in a right state, not in a state conformable to utility, not in the state most conducive to general happiness unless it does love virtue in this manner, as a thing desirable in itself, even although, in the individual instance, it should not produce these other desirable consequences which it does tend to produce, and on account of which it is held to be virtue. This opinion is not, in the smallest degree, a departure from the happiness principle. The ingredients of happiness are very various, and each of them is desirable in itself, and not merely when considered as swelling in aggregate. The principle of utility does not mean that any given pleasure, as music, for instance, or any given exemption from pain, as for example health, is to be looked upon as means to a collective something termed happiness, and to be desired on that account. They are desired and desirable in and for themselves. Besides being means, they are a part of the end. Virtue, according to the utilitarian doctrine, is not naturally and originally a part of the end, but it is capable of becoming so, and in those who love it disinterestedly, it has become so, and is desired and cherished not as a means to happiness, but as part of their happiness. To illustrate this further, we may remember that virtue is not the only thing, only a means, and by which, if it were not a means to anything else, would be and remain indifferent, but by which association with what it is a means to, has come to be desired for itself, and that too with the utmost intensity. What, for example, shall we say about the love of money? There is originally nothing more desirable about money than any heap of glittering pebbles. Its worth is solely that of the things which it will buy, the desires for other things than itself which it is a means of gratifying. Yet the love of money is not only one of the strongest moving forces of human life, but money is, in many cases, desired in and for itself. The desire to possess it is often stronger than the desire to use it, and goes on increasing when all the desires which point to ends beyond it, to be compassed by it, are falling off. It may then be said truly that money is desired not for the sake of an end, but as part of the end. From being a means to happiness, it has come to be itself a principal ingredient in the individual's conception of happiness. The same may be said of the majority of the great objects of human life, power, for example, or fame, except that to each of these there is a certain amount of immediate pleasure annexed, which at least has the semblance of being naturally inherent in them, a thing which cannot be said of money. Still, however, the strongest natural attraction, both of power and of fame, is the immense aid they give to the attainment of our other wishes, and it is the strong association thus generated between them and all objects of our desire, which gives to the direct desire of them the intensity it often assumes, so as in some characters to surpass in strength all other desires. In these cases, the means have become a part of the end, and a more important part of it than of any of the things which they are means to. What was once desired as an instrument for the sake of happiness has come to be desired for its own sake. In being desired for its own sake, it is, however, desired as part of happiness. The person is made, or thinks he would be made, happy by its mere possession, and is made unhappy by failure to obtain it. The desire of it is not a different thing from the desire of happiness, any more than the love of music or the desire of health. They are included in happiness. They are some of the elements of which the desire of happiness is made up. Happiness is not an abstract idea, but a concrete whole, and these are some of its parts. And the utilitarian standard sanctions and approves their being so. Life would be a poor thing, very ill provided with sources of happiness, if there were not this provision of nature, by which things originally indifferent, but conducive to, or otherwise associated with, the satisfaction of our primitive desires, become in themselves sources of pleasure more valuable than the primitive pleasures, both in permanency, in the space of human existence that they are capable of covering, and even in intensity. Virtue, according to the utilitarian conception, is a good of this description. There was no original desire of it, nor motive to it, save its conduciveness to pleasure, and especially to protection from pain. But through the association thus formed, it may be felt a good in itself, and desired as such with as great intensity as any other good. And with this difference between it and love of money, of power, or of fame, that all of these may, and often do, render the individual noxious to the other members of the society to which he belongs, whereas there is nothing which makes him so much a blessing to them as the cultivation of this disinterested love of virtue. And consequently, the utilitarian standard, while it tolerates and approves these other acquired desires, up to the point beyond which they would be more injurious to the general happiness than promotive of it, enjoins and requires the cultivation of the love of virtue up to the greatest strength possible, as being above all things important to the general happiness. It results from the preceding considerations that there is in reality nothing desired except happiness. What is desired otherwise than as a means to some end beyond itself, and ultimately to happiness, is desired itself as a part of happiness, and not desired for itself until it has become so. Those who desire virtue for its own sake desire it either because the consciousness of it is a pleasure, or because the consciousness of being without it is a pain, or for both reasons united. As in truth, the pleasure and pain seldom exist separately, but almost always together, the same person feeling pleasure in the degree of virtue attained, and pain in not having attained more. If one of these gave him no pleasure, and the other no pain, he would not love or desire virtue, or would desire it only for the other benefits which it might produce to himself or to persons whom he cared for. We have now, then, an answer to the question of what sort of proof the principle of utility is susceptible. If the opinion which I have now stated is psychologically true, if human nature is so constituted as to desire nothing which is not either a part of happiness or a means of happiness, then we can have no other proof, and we require no other. Not these are the only things desirable. If so, happiness is the sole end of human action, and the promotion of it the test by which to judge of all human conduct, from whence it necessarily follows that it must be the criterion of morality, since a part is included in the whole. Need to take a moment. And now to decide whether this is really so, whether mankind does desire nothing for itself but that which is a pleasure to it, or of which the absence is a pain, we have evidently arrived at a question of fact and experience, dependent, like all similar questions, upon evidence. It can only be determined by practiced self-consciousness and self-observation, assisted by the observation of others. I believe that these sources of evidence, impartially consulted, will declare that desiring a thing and finding it pleasant, aversion to it and thinking of it as painful, are phenomena entirely inseparable, or rather two parts of the same phenomenon. In strictness of language, two different modes of naming the same psychological fact, that to think of an object as desirable, unless for the sake of its consequences, and to think of it as pleasant, are one and the same thing, and that to desire anything, except in proportion as the idea of it is pleasant, is a physical and metaphysical impossibility. So obvious does this appear to me that I expect it will hardly be disputed, and the objection will be made, not that desire can possibly be directed to anything ultimately except pleasure and exemption from pain, but that the will is a different thing from desire, that a person of confirmed virtue, or any other person whose purposes are fixed, carries out his purposes without any thought of the pleasure he has in contemplating them, or expects to derive from their fulfillment, and persists in acting on them even though those pleasures are much diminished by changes in his character or decay of his passive sensibilities, or are outweighed by the pains which the pursuit of the purposes may bring upon them. All this I fully admit, and have stated it elsewhere as positively and empathetically as anyone. Will, the active phenomenon, is a different thing from desire, the state of passive sensibility, and though originally an offshoot from it, may in time take root and detach itself from the parent stock, So much so that in the case of a habitual purpose, instead of willing the thing because we desire it, we often desire it only because we will it. This, however, is but an instance of that familiar fact, the power of habit, and is no wise confined to the use of virtuous actions. Many different things which men originally did from a motive of some sort, they continue to do from habit. Sometimes this is done unconsciously, the consciousness coming only after the action. At other times with conscious volition, volition which has become habitual, and is put in operation by the force of habit, in opposition perhaps to the deliberate preference, as often happens with those who have contracted habits of vicious or hurtful indulgence. Third and last comes the case in which the habitual act of will in the individual instance is not in contradiction to the general intention prevailing at other times, but in fulfillment of it, as in the case of the person of confirmed virtue, and of all who pursue deliberately and consistently any determinate end. The distinction between will and desire thus understood is an authentic and highly important psychological fact, but the fact consists solely in this, that will, like all other parts of our constitution, is amenable to habit, and that we may form will from habit when we no longer desire for itself. Yeah. And that we may will from habit what we no longer desire for itself, or desire only because we will it. It is not the less true that will, in the beginning, is entirely produced by desire, including in that term the repelling influence of pain as well as the attractive one of pleasure. Let us take into consideration no longer the person who has a confirmed will to do right, but him in whom that virtuous will is still feeble, conquerable by temptation, and not to be fully relied upon. By what means can it be strengthened? How can the will to be virtuous, where it does not exist in sufficient force, be implanted or awakened? Only by making the person desire virtue, by making him think of it in a pleasurable light, or of its absence in a painful one. It is by associating the doing right with pleasure, or the doing wrong with pain, or by eliciting and impressing and bringing home to the person's experience the pleasure naturally involved in one or the pain in the other, that it is possible to call forth that will to be virtuous, which, when confirmed, acts without any thought of either pleasure or pain. Will is the child of desire, and passes out of the dominion of the parent only to come under that of habit. That which is the result of habit affords no presumption of being intrinsically good, and there would be no reason for wishing that the purpose of virtue should become independent of pleasure and pain, were it not that the influence of the pleasurable and painful associations which prompt to virtue is not sufficiently to be depended on for unerring constancy of action until it has acquired the support of habit. Both in feeling and in conduct, habit is the only thing which imparts certainty, and it is because of the importance to others of being able to rely absolutely on one's feelings and conduct, and to oneself that being able to rely on one's own, that the will to do right ought to be cultivated into this habitual independence. In other words, this state of the will is the means to good, not intrinsically a good, and does not contradict the doctrine that nothing is a good to human beings but insofar that it is either itself pleasurable, or a means of attaining pleasure or averting pain. But if this doctrine be true, the principle of utility is proved. Whether it be so or not now must be left to the consideration of the thoughtful reader. That is the end of chapter 4. I need to get up and stretch, and I will be back shortly. Alrighty. On to Chapter 5. Chapter 5. On the connection between justice and utility. In all ages of speculation, one of the strongest obstacles to the reception of the doctrine that utility or happiness is the criterion of right and wrong has been drawn from the idea of justice, the powerful sentiment and apparently clear perception which that word recalls with a rapidity and certainty resembling an instinct have seemed to the majority of thinkers to point to an inherent quality in things, to show that the just must have an existence in nature as something absolute, generically distinct from every variety of the expedient, and in turn opposed to it, though, as is commonly acknowledged, never in the long run disjointed from it in fact. In the case of this, as of our other moral sentiments, there is no necessary connection between the question of its origin and that of its binding force. That a feeling is bestowed upon us by nature does not necessarily legitimate all its promptings. The feeling of justice might be a peculiar instinct, and might yet require, like our other instincts, to be controlled and enlightened by a higher reason. If we have intellectual instincts leading us to judge in a particular way, as well as animal instincts that prompt us to act in a particular way, then there is no necessity that the former should be more invaluable in their sphere than the latter in theirs. It may well happen that wrong judgments are occasionally triggered by these, as wrong actions have by these. It may well happen that wrong judgments are occasionally triggered by those, as wrong actions by these. But though it is one thing to believe that we have natural feelings of justice, and another to acknowledge them as the ultimate criterion of conduct, those two opinions are very closely connected in point of fact. Mankind are always predisposed to believe that any subjective feeling not otherwise accounted for is a revelation of some objective reality. Our present objective is to determine whether the reality to which the feeling of justice corresponds is one which needs any such special revelation, whether the justice or injustice of an action is a thing intrinsically peculiar and distinct from all its other qualities, or only a combination of certain of those qualities presented under a peculiar aspect. For the purpose of this inquiry, it is practically important to consider whether the feeling itself of justice and injustice is sui generis like our sensations of color and taste, or a derivative feeling, formed by a combination of others. And this it is the more essential to examine, as people are in general willing to allow that objectively the dictates of justice coincide with a part of the field of general expediency. But inasmuch as the subjective mental feeling of justice is different from that which commonly attaches to simple expediency, and, except in extreme cases of the latter, is far more imperative in its demands, people find it difficult to see in justice only a particular kind or branch of general utility, and think that its superior binding force requires a totally different origin. To throw light upon this question, it is necessary to attempt to ascertain what is the distinguishing character of justice or of injustice, what is the quality, or whether there is any quality attributed in common to all modes of conduct designated as unjust. For justice, like many other moral attributes, is best defined by its opposite, and distinguishing them from such modes of conduct as are disapproved, but without having that particular epithet of disapprobation applied to them. If in everything which men are accustomed to characterize as just or unjust, there is one common attribute or collection of attributes always present, we may judge whether this particular attribute or combination of attributes would be capable of gathering round it a sentiment of that peculiar character and intensity by virtue of the general laws of our emotional constitution, or whether the sentiment is inexplicable and requires to be regarded as a special provision of nature. If we find the former to be the case, we shall, in resolving this question, have resolved also the main problem. If the latter, we shall have to seek for some other mode of investigating it. To find the various attributes of a variety of objects, it is necessary to begin by surveying the objects themselves in the concrete. Let us therefore advert successively to the various successively to the various modes of action and arrangements of human affairs, which are classed by universal or widely spread opinion as just or unjust. The things well known to excite the sentiment associated with those names are of a very multifarious character. I shall pass them rapidly in review without studying any particular arrangement. In the first place, it is mostly considered unjust to deprive any one of his personal liberty, his property, or any other thing which belongs to him by law. Here, therefore, is an instance of the application of the terms just and unjust in a perfectly definite sense, namely that it is just to respect, unjust to violate, the legal rights of any one. But this judgment admits of several exceptions, arising from the other forms in which the notions of justice and injustice present themselves. For example, the person who suffers the deprivation may, as the phrase is, have forfeited the rights to which he is so deprived of, a case to which we shall return presently, but also, secondly, the legal rights of which he is deprived may be rights which ought not to have belonged to him. In other words, the law which confers upon him these rights may be a bad law. When it is so, or when, which is the same thing for our purpose, it is supposed to be so, opinions will differ as to the justice or injustice of infringing it. Some maintain that no law, however bad, ought to be disobeyed by an individual citizen, that his opposition to it, if shown at all, should only be shown in endeavoring to get it altered by competent authority. This opinion, which condemns many of the most illustrious benefactors of mankind, and would often protect pernicious institutions against the only weapons which, in the state of things existing at the time, have any chance of succeeding against them, is defended by those who hold it on grounds of expediency, principally on that of the importance to the common interest of mankind of maintaining inviolate the sentiment of submission to law. Other persons, again, hold the directly contrary opinion, that any law, judged to be bad, may be blamelessly disobeyed, even though it not be judged to be unjust, but only inexpedient, while others would confine the license of disobedience to the case of unjust laws. But again, some say that all laws which are inexpedient are unjust, since every law imposes some restriction on the natural liberty of mankind, which restriction is an injustice, unless legitimated by tending to their good. Among these there are diversities of opinion that seems to be universally admitted that there may be unjust laws, and that law, consequently, is not the ultimate criterion of justice, but may give to one person a benefit or impose on another an evil which justice condemns. When, however, a law is thought to be unjust, it always seems to be regarded as being so in the same way in which a breach of law is unjust, namely, by infringing someone's right, which, as it cannot in this case be a legal right, receives a different appellation, and is called a moral right. We may say, therefore, that a second case of injustice consists in taking or withholding from any person that to which he has a moral right. Thirdly, it is universally considered just that each person should obtain, whether good or evil. Thirdly, it is universally considered just that each person should obtain that, whether good or evil, which he deserves, and unjust that he should obtain a good or be made to undergo an evil which he does not deserve. This is perhaps the clearest and most empathetic form in which the idea of justice is conceived by the general mind. As it involves the notion of desert, the question arises, what constitutes desert? Speaking in a general way, a person is understood to deserve good if he does right, evil if he does wrong, and in a more particular sense, to deserve the good from those to whom he does or has done good, and evil from those to whom he does or has done evil. The precept of returning good for evil has never been regarded as a case of the fulfillment of justice, but as one in which the claims of justice are waived in obedience to other considerations. Fourthly, it is confessedly unjust to break faith with anyone, to violate an engagement, whether express or implied, or disappoint expectations raised by our own conduct, at least if we have raised those expectations knowingly and voluntarily. Likewise, the other obligations of justice already spoken of, this one is not regarded as absolute, but as capable of being overruled by a stronger obligation of justice on the other side, or by such conduct on the part of the person concerned as is deemed to absolve us of our obligation from him and to constitute a forfeiture of the benefit which he has been led to expect. Fifthly, it is, by universal admission, inconsistent with justice to be partial, to show favor or preference to one person over another in matters to which favor and preference do not properly apply. Impartiality, however, does not seem to be regarded as a duty in itself, but rather as instrumental to some other duty, for it is admitted that favor and preference are not always censurable, and indeed in cases in which they are condemned are rather the exception than the rule. A person would be more likely to be blamed than applauded for giving his friends or family no superiority in good offices over strangers, when he could do so without violating any other duty. And no one thinks it unjust to seek one person in preference to another as a friend, connection, or companion. Impartiality, where rights are concerned, is of course obligatory, but this is involved in the more general obligation of giving to everyone his right. A tribunal, for example, must be impartial, because it is bound to award, without regard to any other consideration, a disputed object to the one of two parties who has the right to it. There are other cases in which impartiality means being solely influenced by desert, as with those who, in the capacity of judges, preceptors, or parents, administer reward and punishment as such. There are cases, again, by which it means being solely influenced by consideration for the public interest, as in making a selection among candidates for a government employment. Impartiality, in short, as an obligation of justice, may be said to mean being exclusively influenced by the considerations which it is supposed ought to influence the particular case in hand, and resisting the solicitation of any motives which prompt to conduct different from what the considerations would dictate. Water. Nearly allied with the idea of impartiality is that of equality, which often enters as a component part both into the conception of justice and into the practice of it, and, in the eyes of many persons, constitutes its essence. But in this, still more than in any other case, the notion of justice varies in different persons, and always conforms in its variations to their notion of utility. Each person maintains that equality is the dictate of justice, except where he thinks that expediency requires inequality. The justice of giving equal protection to the rights of all is maintained by those who support the most outrageous inequality in those rights themselves. Even in slave countries, it is theoretically admitted that the rights of the slave, such as they are, ought to be as sacred as those of the master, and that a tribunal which fails to enforce them with equal strictness is wanting in justice, while at the same time institutions which leave to the slave scarcely any rights to enforce are not deemed unjust, because they are not deemed inexpedient. Those who think that utility requires distinctions of rank do not consider it unjust that riches and social privileges should be unequally dispensed. But those who think this inequality inexpedient think it unjust also. Whoever thinks that government is necessary sees no injustice, inasmuch as inequality is constituted by giving to the magistrate powers not granted to other people. Even among those who hold leveling doctrines, there are as many questions of justice as there are differences of opinion about expediency. Some communists consider it unjust that the produce of the labor of the community should be shared on any other principle other than that of exact equality. Others think it just that those who should receive most whose wants are greatest, while others hold that those who work harder or produce more or whose services are more valuable to the community may justly claim a larger quota in the division of the produce. And the sense of natural justice may be plausibly appealed to in behalf of every one of these opinions. Among the diverse applications of the term justice, which yet is not regarded as ambiguous, there is some difficulty, it is a matter of some difficulty to seize the mental link which holds them together, and on which the moral sentiment adhering to the term essentially depends. Perhaps in this embarrassment some help may be derived from the history of the word as indicated by its etymology. The most, if not in all languages, the etymology of the word, which corresponds to just, points distinctly at an origin connected with the ordinances of law. Justum is a form of justum, that which has been ordered. I have no idea how to pronounce this. Ikalv comes directly from certain, a suit at law. Recht, from which come right and justice, is synonymous with law. The courts of justice, the administration of justice, are the courts and the administration of law. The justice in French is the established word for justicer. Judisticer. I am not committing the fallacy imputed with some show of truth to Horn-Tuck, of assuming a word must still continue to mean what it originally meant. Etymology is slight evidence of how the idea now signified is, but the very best evidence of how it sprang up. There can, I think, be no doubt that the idea mere, the primitive element, in the formation of the notion of justice was conformity of law. It constituted the entire idea among the Hebrews up to the birth of Christianity, as might well be expected in the case of people whose laws attempt to embrace all subjects on which the precepts were required, and who believe those laws to be a direct emanation from the Supreme Being. But other nations, and in particular the Greeks and Romans, who knew that their laws had been made originally, and still continued to be made, by men, were not afraid to admit that these men might make bad laws, might do, by law, the same things, and from the same motives, which if done by individuals without the sanction of law would be called unjust, and hence the sentiment of injustice came to be attached not to all violations of law, but only to violations of such laws as ought to exist, including such as ought to exist but do not, and to laws themselves if supposed to be contrary to what ought to be law. In this manner, the idea of law and of its injunctions was still prominent in the notion of justice, even when the laws actually in force ceased to be accepted as the standard of it. It is true that mankind considers the idea of justice and its obligations as applicable to many things which neither are, nor is it desired that they should be, regulated by law. Nobody desires that laws should interfere with the whole detail of private life, yet everyone allows that in all daily conduct a person may and does show himself to be either just or unjust. But even here, the idea of the breach of what ought to be law still lingers in a modified shape. It would always give us pleasure and chime in with our feelings of fitness that acts which we deem unjust should be punished, though we do not always think it expedient that this should be done by the tribunals. We forego that gratification on account of incidental inconveniences. We should be glad to see just conduct enforced and injustice repressed, even in the minutest details, were we not, with reason, afraid of trusting the magistrate with so unlimited an amount of power over individuals? When we think that a person is bound in justice to do a thing, it is an ordinary form of language to say that he ought to be compelled to do it. We should be gratified to see the obligation enforced by anybody who had the power. If we see that its enforcement by law would be inexpedient, we lament the impossibility, we consider the impunity given to injustice as an evil, and strive to make amends for it by bringing a strong expression of our own and the public disapprobation to bear upon the offender. Thus, the idea of legal constraint is still the generating idea of the notion of justice. though undergoing several transformations before that notion, as it exists in advance of society, becomes complete. The above, I think, a true account, as far as it goes, of the origin and progressive nature of the idea of justice. But we must observe that it contains as yet nothing to distinguish that obligation from moral obligation in general. For the truth is that the idea of penal sanction, which is the essence of law, enters not only into the conception of injustice, but into that of any kind of wrong. We do not call anything wrong unless we mean to imply that a person ought to be punished in some way or other for doing it, if not by law, by the opinion of his fellow creatures, and if not by opinion, then by the reproaches of his own conscience. This seems to be the real turning point of the distinction between morality and simple expediency. It is part of the notion of duty in every one of its forms, that a person may rightfully be compelled to do it. Duty is a thing which may be exacted from a person, as one exacts a debt. Unless we think it may be exacted from him, we do not call it his duty. Reasons of prudence, or the interest of other people, may militate against actually exacting it, but the person himself, it is clearly understood, would not be entitled to complain. There are other things, on the contrary, which we wish that people should do, which we like or admire them for doing, perhaps dislike or despise them for not doing, but yet admit they are not bound to do so. It is not a case of moral obligation. We do not blame them, that is, we do not think that they are proper objects of punishment. How we come by these ideas of deserving and not deserving punishment will appear, perhaps, in the sequel, but I think that there is no doubt that this distinction lies at the bottom of the notions of right and wrong, that we call any conduct wrong, or employ, instead, some other term of dislike or disparagement, according as we think that the person ought or ought not to be punished for it. And we say it would be right to do so, or merely that it would be desirable or laudable, according as we would wish to see the person whom it concerns compelled or only persuaded and exhorted to act in that manner. This, therefore, being the characteristic difference which marks off, not justice, but morality in general, from the remaining provinces of expediency and worthiness. The character is still to be sought which distinguishes justice from other branches of morality. Now it is known that ethical writers divide moral duties into two classes, denoted by the ill-chosen expressions: duties of perfect and of imperfect obligation, the latter being those in which, though the act is obligatory, the particular occasions of performing it are left to our choice, as in the case of charity or beneficence, which we are indeed bound to practice, though not towards any definite person, nor at any prescribed time. In the more precise language of philosophic jurists, duties of perfect obligation are those duties in virtue of which a correlative right resides in some person or persons. Duties of imperfect obligations are those moral obligations which do not give birth to any right. I think it will be found that this distinction exactly coincides with that which exists between justice and the other obligations of morality. In our survey of the various popular acceptations of justice, the term appeared generally to involve the idea of a personal right, a claim on the part of one or more individuals, like that which the law gives, which it confers a proprietary or other legal right. Whether the injustice consists in depriving a person of a possession, or in breaking faith with him, or in treating him worse than he deserves, or worse than other people who have no greater claims, in each case the supposition implies two things: a wrong done, and some assignable person who is wronged. Injustice may also be done by treating a person better than others, but the wrong in this case is to his competitors, who are also assignable persons. It seems to me that this feature is in the case, a right in some person correlative to the moral obligation constitutes the specific difference between justice and generosity or beneficence. Justice implies something which it is not only right to do and wrong not to do, but which some individual person can claim from us as his moral right. No one has a moral right toward generosity or beneficence because we are not morally bound to practice those virtues towards any given individual. And it will be found with respect to this as to every correct definition that the instances which seem to conflict with it are those which most conform to it. For if a moralist attempts, as some have done, to make out that mankind generally, though not any given individual, have a right to all the good we can do them, he at once, by that thesis, includes generosity and beneficence within the category of justice. He is obligated to say that our utmost exertions are due to our fellow creatures, thus assimilating them to a debt, or that nothing less can be a sufficient return for what society does for us, thus classing the case as one of gratitude, both of which are acknowledged cases of justice. Wherever there is a right, the case is of justice, and not of the virtue of beneficence. And whoever does not place the distinction between justice and morality in general, where we have now placed it, will be found to make no distinction between them at all, but merge all morality in justice. There is a note. In the concluding pages of this work, Mill gives renewed emphasis to the position previously taken that social utility is the criterion of justice as of all virtue and rules morality. The feelings associated with justice are strong, he says, because they spring from such powerful urges as self-defense and sympathy for others. Thus, justice remains the appropriate name for certain social utilities which are vastly more important and therefore more absolute and imperative than any others as a class, and which therefore ought to be, as well as naturally are, guarded by a sentiment not only different in degree but also in kind, distinguished from the milder feeling which attaches to the mere idea of promoting human pleasure or convenience, at once by the more definite nature of its commands and by the sterner character of its sanctions. And this finishes our reading of John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism. I need to stand up and maybe go wash my eyes out. I will be back in a bit. I'm going to stop the stream so that I can upload these separately.